I wish you a good stay in my cabin. I'll come by later to check how you've settled in. And to meet your wife. I insist.
The Dark Presence is an incorporeal, supernatural entity behind much of the strange and destructive events in the fictional town of Bright Falls, as seen in the Alan Wake franchise from Remedy Entertainment. Possessing horrifying powers in its own right, most notably, the ability to influence minds with a touch and possess human bodies by utterly destroying the humanity within them, this malevolent intelligence serves as the primary antagonist of the series. Our first known encounter with the Dark Presence began when a poet by the name of Thomas Zane visited Bright Falls in the 1970s. Known for his fondness of recreational diving in the waters of Cauldron Lake, so much so that the island on which he owned a comfortable log cabin became known as Diver's Island by the locals. Both he and his lover, Barbara Jagger, had been staying in the town while Tom worked on his poetry, with occasional input from his assistant, Emil Hartman. It hadn't taken long for Tom to notice a strange power within the lake. One which seemed to take the words he wrote and made them into reality. Sharing his discovery with them both, Tom soon began using this newfound power to further his work and rose to a degree of popularity for the quality of his writing. On July 10th, 1970, Barbara drowned in the waters of Cauldron Lake without warning, despite generally being known as a very capable swimmer. Devastated by her death and urged on by Emil, Tom did the only thing he could think to try. He attempted to write his love back to life using the reality-altering powers of the lake, a plan which miraculously worked, after a fashion. While it seemed, for all appearances, that Barbara Jagger had indeed returned from the dead, it wasn't long before Tom realized something was terribly wrong with the woman who now stood before him. Something sinister and dark to the core. Realizing the mistake he had made and the true extent of the danger he had created, Tom restrained the thing wearing his lover's skin as best he could, and, ignoring the sweet, sickening words dripping from her lips, tried to cut the heart out of her, only to discover nothing but empty darkness beneath her breast. Desperate now, the poet formed a new plan, one which he hoped would at least constrain the horror he had unleashed. Using the power of the lake once more, Tom wrote everything about himself and Barbara, everything they had done, and all of Tom's work. Anything involving their situation which hadn't been stored safely in a shoebox, out of existence entirely. With that one final step taken, he donned the diving equipment that had brought him so much joy one last time before plunging both himself and the monster pretending to be his lover into the deepest depths of that dark lake, banishing them both from the world. Most likely, as a result, a series of volcanic earthquakes struck Bright Falls, sinking Diver's Isle and putting an end to the area's prosperous mining industry as vital tunnels were flooded during the catastrophe. Though Thomas Zane did succeed in stopping the Dark Presence from being unleashed upon the world fully, the entity wasn't destroyed, only contained, trapped within the dark place from which it had come, but still waiting for another mind to tap into the power underneath the lake. During the majority of the 1970s, however, the Dark Presence seems to have been totally focused on a rock and roll band by the name of the Old Gods of Asgard. At one point, even coming into direct conflict with the two founding members, Odin and Thor, in a battle that is implied to be not unlike Alan Wake's own experience with the entity, defeating the presence, but suffering severe mental trauma as a result. Otherwise, from everything we can tell, the Dark Presence lay dormant beneath the waves of Cauldron Lake, biding its time until Alan and his wife Alice finally arrived in the small town. On its own, the Dark Presence doesn't seem to possess any particular form, appearing primarily as a mass of whirling darkness that moves like inky smoke through the air. Or, since the events of Diver's Island, still wearing the skin of Barbara Jagger, having aged in appearance at the same rate a human body normally would. It can also be encountered as a flock of ravens, seemingly formed completely from pure darkness, easily dispelled by the light, but deadly nonetheless. Though there is some debate as to whether this is the Dark Presence taking a form itself, or simply a normal flock of birds having been taken over by the being. On rare occasion, we've seen the entity appear to rampage as a whirling torrent of shadow, destructive to the extreme, and apparently free to operate in the open as it pleases, using whatever happens to be nearby as a weapon. Whatever its appearance, the abilities of the Dark Presence remain basically the same. As already mentioned, the Dark Presence is capable of possessing human bodies, destroying anything human left inside the person, and consuming them completely, leaving little more than mindless puppets shrouded in impenetrable shadow. These possessed humans, or Taken as they're commonly known, are the primary weapon used by the Presence against those who would attempt to thwart its plans of escape. Vicious and merciless, there is nothing remaining of the person's personality once taken, other than an odd impulse to spout seemingly random, garbled sayings related to their previous lives. A sort of nervous twitch more than anything else. They've also been shown to be capable of simply appearing out of the darkness to strike without warning, making them capable and deadly ambush attackers. When a mindless body isn't enough for the entity's needs, it can also choose to merely touch the mind of a person as means of manipulating their actions rather than outright controlling them, as seen with Rose Marigold when the Presence used her to lure Alan Wake and his agent Barry Wheeler to her trailer, or its influence pushing Alan to nearly release the otherworldly threat after the disappearance of his wife. Though far less destructive to a person than being taken completely, it would seem that practically any contact with the Dark Presence leaves the victim with serious psychological damage, if they manage to survive the encounter in the first place. Rose was left barely responsive and muttering to herself incoherently, while Cynthia Weaver became known as a local crazy for her bizarre and neurotic behavior, which stems, at least partially, from her connection to Thomas Zane. However, these abilities, while incredibly dangerous, do not adequately convey the true existential threat posed by the Dark Presence. Though the entity originates from, and is bound to, the Dark Place, a surreal dimension of pure primordial creativity, it appears incapable of using these reality-altering properties of its own volition, needing to instead manipulate creative human beings unfortunate enough to come within reach, using the power of its touch to influence their thoughts and personality. The Presence manipulates creative minds into subtle changes of their work, nudging them to create the perfect balance of narrative elements that will allow it to finally be released from the Dark Place and set loose upon our reality, free to spread its darkness across the entire world. Even when thwarted with the very same power that could release it, the Dark Presence has shown itself more than capable of abusing any undefined opening left in the narrative against it as a means of further manipulation against the writer, trying to force their hand through violence and fear when its touch alone proves inadequate for the task. We are never clearly told whether or not the Dark Presence has always existed within the dark place it calls both home and prison, or if it was the darkest parts of Thomas Zane's own imagination that birthed the hostile intelligence that has plagued Bright Falls ever since. According to the presence itself, it has existed far longer than the likes of Alan Wake could believe, but considering its preference for lies and manipulation as tools to get what it wants, it's hard to know just how much of what it says is actually true. What we can say for certain is that our reality would be in serious trouble if this malicious entity ever succeeds in releasing itself from the darkness beneath Cauldron Lake. What do you think the origin of the Dark Presence is? Was it created when Thomas Zane first tried to bring Barbara back from the dead, or is it something far older? Alan Wake is one of my favorite game franchises, and I always hoped we would be able to learn more about the surprisingly complex setting the studio crafted in the now unfortunately scrapped sequel. But getting a chance to look back at it as my first non-Absolver lore video has still been a lot of fun. If there's any other lore topics you'd like me to explore or explain, feel free to let me know in the comments. Oh, and if you enjoyed the video and want to see more, don't forget to subscribe, and a like is always appreciated. Thanks for watching.
It's not a lake. It's an ocean.